So finally, we should think about on liberty in the 21st century, our time, and how it still applies, how important it still is, and how many other people have thought about it, written about it, and continued to pursue the question of how you preserve liberty. So here's his conclusions in his book on liberty. Human beings are most creative when they are free. Very, very major point. You can see its roots back into Bentham and utilitarianism, and you can see that this is related to the Declaration of Independence, 1776, because we began speaking of pursuit of happiness. Number two, human beings are happiest when free. That I put a question mark there just because many writers of the second half of the 19th century, knowing this idea, raised a question mark over it. So Dostoevsky was the most important one in his great novels. Were people happy to be free? Nietzsche will take it up too. But I think most of us will agree together that yes, human beings are happiest when free. Three, all of this is only possible with absolute freedom of speech. Number four, freedom of print. No restrictions. Now, Mill is confirming in 1859 what Milton wrote in 1640 in the middle of the Civil War. England was never in greater danger than from 1640 to 1650, and in the middle of the Civil War, John Milton wrote his great book on freedom of the press and freedom of speech, and he said there should be no restrictions. So you have 200 years here in which the libertarians, pro-free speech, are totally agreed. No limits on freedom. John Locke would agree, and so would all the other philosophers in the English tradition. Okay, number five, total freedom of association. And you can see this includes a Jeremy Bentham idea that two males should be able to associate with each other any way they want, and the state should have nothing to do with it. Number six, equality of the sexes, male-female equality. Couldn't be more revolutionary, more shocking in 1859, but that was exactly Mr. and Mrs. Mill's position. Seven, women's total equality and vote. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. That's it. What is classical liberalism? Well, here is as good a summary as you're ever going to get. People understand their own business and their own interests better and care for them more than the government does or can be expected to do. This could be right in Milton Friedman's book on liberty and in all kinds of other books. I mean, it's very simple. It's a great quote. People understand their own business and their own interests better and care for them more than the government does. Then he published his book on the subjection of women. It is basically a book he and Harriet wrote together. He is going to call for the vote for women in a bill introduced into Parliament. First person in history of Parliament to call for women to be given the right to vote, defending his position in the subsequent debate. You can imagine what this meant in English society in the 1860s with a lady queen. This all has a relationship to Victoria and the world she's living in. He turns out to have been right. So he's on the cutting edge. He's ahead of everybody else. And you can all understand where this comes from. I mean, his unconventional life, his unconventional lifestyle, his falling in love with another man's wife, and his attempt to get both things, to get his time with her, but in no way hurt the husband. It's all very interesting, and it shows you how it contributes to both of them writing powerful political propaganda. Mrs. Mill says, we deny the right of any portion of the species to decide for another portion what is and what is not their proper sphere. The proper sphere for all human beings is the largest and highest which they are able to attain. So here we go. Here's Mrs. Mill. Now, at the end here, I want to share with some of the things that Isaiah Berlin has said and written about John Stuart Mill. It's the best stuff that anybody's written about on liberty. Isaiah Berlin was a Russian born in 1909, so he and his family experienced the Soviet Revolution, escaped, came to Britain, born in Riga, Latvia, 1909. They went to Russia, St. Petersburg, and witnessed the revolution. 21, his family moved to the United Kingdom and made sure that their brilliant little son was educated at the best school in the whole country, which was St. Paul's School, and then the best college, Oxford. So Isaiah Berlin is basically a child of the English educational system. He was a lifelong Oxford don, an Oxford professor. He was one of the most brilliant men who's ever lived, and he didn't like sitting down to write stuff, so he lectured constantly, and then people took him down and published them. And he was glad about editing, and that was just fine. So that's what he did. And of course, he was capable of composing a lecture in his brain and making notes and then giving a lecture that could be printed. That's how perfect his lectures were. Here's Isaiah Berlin. He continued to profess that happiness was the sole end of human existence, but his conception of what contributed to it changed into something very different from that of his mentors, Jeremy Bentham, for what he came to value most was neither rationality nor contentment, but diversity, versatility, fullness of life, the unaccountable leap of individual genius, the spontaneity and the uniqueness of a man or woman, group, or civilization. Please hold on to that. Please hold on to that brilliant insight into what Mill finally came to as happiness, because it's exactly what the later 19th century writers like Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky are going to put forward in their books, that is exactly the greatness of the individual, is versatility, fullness of life. For him, says Berlin, man differs from animals primarily neither as the possessor of reason nor as an inventor of tools, but as being capable of choice, one who is most himself in choosing and not being chosen for. That is freedom. Again, here's Kierkegaard, here's Dostoevsky, and other great French writers. All see this in the second half of the 19th century when Romanticism is being refined and people are trying to figure out how to say it all. Mill said it perfectly. Berlin on John Stuart Mill. He was committed to the view that we can never tell until we've tried where greater truth or happiness or any other form of experience may lie. Finality is therefore in principle impossible. All solutions must be tentative and provisional. This is existentialism. This is the core of existentialism of Kierkegaard and other writers. It runs directly counter to 18th century utilitarianism, which of course he had been brought up in, which rested on the view that there exists an unalterable nature of things, a science, and can, in principle, be scientifically discovered once and for all. These are the positivists. This was a school from the 18th century into the 19th century. They're called positivists. There were famous ones in the 19th century, and they are still around us today. There's a very famous and great writer and thinker, Steven Pinker, and he's essentially in this tradition. The notion of a single true doctrine carrying salvation to all men everywhere, contained in natural law or the revelation of sacred book or the insight of a man of genius or the natural wisdom of ordinary men, this is bound to be mistaken. Now, those of you listening and reading who think you know something about a revelation or a sacred book like the Bible can hold on to it, because Mill is going to create a society in which you have absolute and total freedom to pursue that book and its truth as much as you want, as long as you don't enslave everybody else in the society to the same book. Mill believes that man and woman is spontaneous and that they have freedom of choice, and that they mold their own character, that as a result of interplay of men with nature and with other men, something novel continuously arises, and that this novelty is precisely what is most characteristic and most human in all human beings. Because Mill's entire view of human nature turns out to rest not on the notion of repetition of an identical pattern, but on his perception of human lives as subject to perpetual incompleteness and self-transformation and novelty, his words are today alive and relevant to us and our problems, which, of course, is the essence of the long and still alive existential tradition which runs through Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, and then a whole long list of 20th century figures like Albert Camus would be the most important. And as Berlin adds, the scientists, like his father, James Mill, or Buckle in France, Comte, Spencer in England, all are just forgotten hulks in the river of 19th century thought. Because Mill's entire view of human nature turns out to rest not on the notion of repetition, J.S. Mill sees human condition in a very similar way to Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky. Take Notes from the Underground. If you want one book by Dostoevsky to pursue this thought brilliantly, just go get Notes from the Underground. That's all. Mill is not interested in actuarial calculations. At the center of his thought and the feeling lies not his utilitarianism, nor the concern about Enlightenment ideas, nor about dividing private from public, but his attempt to fuse rationalism, that means the Enlightenment, and Romanticism, the same aim as the great German poet-writer Goethe. Berlin on J.S. Mill greatness. The 19th century, he wanted to fuse the scientific drive of the Enlightenment with the spirit and the emotion of Romanticism. A rich, spontaneous, many-sided, fearless, free, and yet rational, self-directed character. The J.S. Mill image of man as a creative being, incapable of self-completion, and therefore never wholly predictable, fallible, complex combination of opposites, some reconcilable, others not, happiness, novelty, freedom, but no guarantees, theological or logical, imperfect, but capable of determining his own destiny in circumstances favorable to the development of his reason and his gifts. All of this now called classical liberalism. Hugely successful in the 19th century. Thomas Hardy recalled that undergraduates in the 1960s at Oxford knew the book almost by heart, meaning 1870s and 80s. Criticism of the book in the 19th century came chiefly from thinkers who felt that Mill's concept of liberty left the door open for barbarism. Also, now in the 20th century, lots of people critics regard his essay as a seminal work in British liberalism. John Stuart Mill died in Avignon, of course, wanted to be buried next to Harriet. He returned there, went back to Britain, of course, wrote, published, but returned there and happened to be there when he was stricken and died and was buried next to her, which was exactly the way he wanted it. So all of you people who want to do a trip in France someday, go down the Rhone River, stop at Avignon. It's a great stop. Patty Fredlund has written up a beautiful page in our travel guide on Avignon. So if we were all ready to go to France, maybe late in the year or sometime, then go to look it up. And that is our evening on John Stuart Mill, one of the greatest heroes of the Western tradition, a kind of summary statement of the long, well-developed tradition on liberty. So